For this module, we're going to talk about all sorts of acronyms. You've got international organizations, which are usually abbreviated as IOs or IGOs. You have non-governmental organizations, which are NGOs, and you have international law, which is just international law. It doesn't get an acronym. I wonder if it feels bad about that. It's like, why don't I get to be IL? Everything else gets something. You don't. Sorry, international law. So for our basics, we're going to focus specifically on the United Nations, which is far and away the most important of all of the international organizations on the world stage. The United Nations is not the first attempt at sort of a global organization that would have representation from all countries. We did have the League of Nations, which came about after World War I. It was a slight bit of a colossal failure in as much as World War II happened, so we don't talk about the League much, but it did lay the foundation for the United Nations to be created after World War II. The idea behind the United Nations was, holy crap, we just had this massive world war that was really terrible and lots of people died. What can we do to make sure that that doesn't happen again? And so they created this forum, and it's called a multilateral forum because it is a place for many states to engage on an issue at once to try and prevent that from happening. There were a bunch of other organizations that were also created after World War II. Three of them, very important economic organizations, are called the Bretton Woods organizations, and we will get to those in a later module, but they were created to prevent the Great Depression from happening again. But the United Nations, they're thinking, let's just make sure that we don't have another World War II. And the good news is that at least as of the time that this PowerPoint was recorded, we have not yet had World War III. So I don't want to jinx anything, but I guess if I have jinxed it, then you're probably not listening to this PowerPoint anyway, so I have that going for me. So we have the United Nations, and it's been created in the late 40s, and it's been around since. The idea here is that, and this is not something that people were thinking when they created it, but neoliberal institutionalists would say the great thing about the United Nations is that it creates the opportunity for that repeated prisoner's dilemma. So if you remember what the prisoner's dilemma, the temptation for any two countries interacting on a one-shot deal is to cheat on an agreement or go back on their word because they can get substantial gains from it. But if they know they're going to have to deal with those same countries over and over and over and over again, then suddenly it is in all of their self-interests to cooperate to keep the good times rolling. So the United Nations provides that opportunity for repeated interactions. The United Nations also coordinates all sorts of other international organizations. So there are lots of organizations in this world that have states as members. And remember, that is the key difference between an international organization and a non-governmental organization. International organizations are those things that have countries as their members. So the United Nations, the members of the United Nations are, Burundi and the Dominican Republic and Chile. It's not like Joe down the street and Marissa, they don't have individuals as members. But non-governmental organizations, which are sort of like interest groups for the international realm, those do have individuals. You can join lots of non-governmental organizations, but unless you are actually a country that has somehow gained personification as a person and is taking this online class, you personally cannot join the United Nations as a member state. Sorry to disappoint you if that was your lifelong dream. So there are lots of these associated international organizations, and the UN does help coordinate all the stuff that they do. The United Nations is more successful on some things than it is on others. So we say that the UN has been successful in preventing another World War III, but you could really argue whether it's the UN that's done that or whether it was, the horrors of World War II and the creation of nuclear weapons that raised the stakes for any future conflict. But the United Nations has definitely been successful in areas like economic issues, social cultural issues, certain kinds of security issues. So we'll talk about that in a couple slides, but there are some areas where the UN is more successful than others. So the UN is a bit of a complex organization, as many organizations tend to be. There are different bodies or parts of the UN that we like to talk about. The biggest one is the General Assembly. This is sort of like the legislature of the United Nations. Every country gets one vote, one seat, one voice, regardless of how big it is. Doesn't matter if you're tiny little Djibouti or if you are China or the United States, you have one seat and one vote. The things that the General Assembly passes are not binding because the UN is not a government. It is not the central authority that helps overcome anarchy in the international system. The things it says cannot be backed up, at least the General Assembly resolutions cannot be backed up by force of law. States go along with it because they believe it's in their best interest or not. The General Assembly has, as you might imagine, they take all sorts of issues. Pretty much anything can start there and then either be dealt with or referred elsewhere. But there have been some successes that General Assembly has come up with, but for the most part, it is a forum for international issues to be aired and to be addressed. The Secretariat is the bureaucracy of the United Nations. This is where all of the day-to-day runnings of the United Nations take place. This is where the things that the UN tries to put into place, the people who actually have to run these programs, are based in the Secretariat. The face of the UN is the Secretary General, who is the head of the United Nations, heads the Secretariat. So that is pretty much where the Secretariat comes in terms of things that you would be likely to encounter in your life. The Economic and Social Council, they deal with, as you might imagine from the name, the economic and social issues that come up in the UN, and they also help integrate and coordinate all the various specialized agencies such as the World Health Organization and the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. All these different other international organizations that the UN deals with are coordinated through the Economic and Social Council. Finally, we have the most important part of the UN, which is the Security Council. The Security Council, the resolutions that they come up with are binding on all member states. So when they say something, it becomes important because states it is compulsory that they listen, and I guess the implicit threat is that if they don't, then security forces from the United Nations countries, particularly those on the Security Council, would back up these proclamations. We've never gotten into a point where they've sort of been called on that, so we don't know exactly what would happen if people didn't want to listen. But in theory, what they say is binding. There are 15 countries on the Security Council. 10 of them rotate on a regular basis. And then there are 5 permanent members called the P5, and these are China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Those 5 countries were not chosen randomly, as you might imagine. They were either the countries who were the most powerful when the UN was created. That's why the United States and Russia and the UK are on there. Or they were countries that, in particular, the Western world wanted to help build up their power after the destruction of World War II. So that's why France is on the list, and China, which at the time was not communist, was added to the list as well as a permanent member. So the P5 have a veto. That's kind of the thing that makes them the most important. Nothing can get past the Security Council unless all 5 of those permanent members approve of it. Which you might imagine, if you look at the countries on that list, you're like, there's not a whole lot of things in this world that China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States can all agree on. So that does make it very difficult to find things that you can get all P5 members to agree with. So Security Council resolutions are pretty rare and tend to not be particularly strongly worded or broad-reaching in their effects. The UN has twice authorized the use of military force. One of those times was the first Gulf War. So the Soviet Union had just dissolved. China had yet to rise as a world superpower, so everyone was kind of on the same page for one brief moment in world history. And the other time was the Korean War, when Russia was boycotting the UN, so they couldn't veto the thing that they certainly would have. And China, they were still not acknowledging communist China as being the real China, so Taiwan was sitting in China's seat. So they didn't veto it. So it's pretty rare for there to be an authorization of military force because these 5 countries generally don't agree on who you would use force against. We have definitely seen a shift in terms of the UN's role in security over the course of its history. So one thing to recognize is that the Security Council, they do important things. I don't want to minimize the stuff the Security Council does, but because of that veto and because the 5 countries need to agree, you're not going to get, for example, and watch, I'll say this and then it'll happen, but you're not going to get, in this day and age, the 5 countries to agree to any major military intervention in a conflict between multiple states, or to go after a country that is acting aggressively, because there is usually one side or the other of those countries that have a veto that will find some reason that they don't want to approve of it, don't want to set a precedent where the UN is doing that, or something to that effect. But one thing the UN has become very involved with is the idea of peacekeeping, or as it's now become known because it's kind of shifted, peacemaking. In the beginning, the UN became the group that countries would turn to if they had come to a peace agreement and they needed someone to enforce a ceasefire or enforce a peace agreement. Because as we know, as realists will tell you, countries are happy to cheat on any agreement they can find. So if you need a neutral third party to come in with some troops and stand between you or make sure that everyone's doing the things they're supposed to under the terms of your peace agreement, that's where the UN can come in, and that's peacekeeping. That requires the consent of all of the parties involved. So if it's 2 countries at war, 3 countries at war, they all have to agree to have UN troops come in. Or if it's a civil war, both sides in the civil war need to agree. This has shifted in the last 20 years towards peacemaking, which is a much more aggressive interventionist approach. It doesn't always involve the consent of all of the parties, so it involves a larger UN military force and much more willingness to go in and say, look, there's a civil war going on here, and we are going to put a stop to it. So this usually only happens within a country, not between countries, and it is obviously much more dangerous for the countries that are supplying the troops to the UN. The UN and in the role in the area of security has also been very good in raising the profile of some issues. So, for years there were campaigns to end the use of landmines, but it really picked up speed when the UN adopted it as a cause, and they have successfully done that. So that is something else the UN can be particularly useful at when it comes to security.